Welcome to today's Explainer. Grab a seat because today we're stepping into the lecture hall to unravel a pretty profound mystery. Namely, why does our modern digital world feel so incredibly chaotic, so overwhelmingly instant? Well, to figure that out, we actually need to look backwards. We're going to trace the deep historical relationship between human civilization and the tools we use to communicate. Now, as a historian looking at the grand sweep of human empires, I can tell you right off the bat, the physical materials we use to write, speak, and share information, they aren't just passive tools. They actively, literally shape our minds and our structures of power. So here is our syllabus for today's session. We'll be hitting the bias of communication, media of time and space, paper, print, and power, the electric implosion, and finally, retribalizing the global village. It's going to be a wild, dialectical journey from heavy stone tablets all the way to the invisible electric grids of today. All right, Section 1, the bias of communication. Let's dive right into this foundational thesis, the idea that the physical stuff we communicate with dictates who holds power. We're anchoring our whole inquiry today in the groundbreaking work of Harold Innis, specifically his monumental book, Empire and Communications. Innis was this brilliant thinker who looked at human history and realized something absolutely crucial. He argued that massive political organizations, empires basically, only survive by overcoming the built-in biases of their media. Think about it. An empire's stability doesn't just come down to having a huge army, it comes down to how it manages information. If a society relies way too heavily on just one medium of communication, it develops a structural bias, and eventually, that bias will cause the whole thing to collapse. To really get this, we have to talk about monopolies of knowledge. Innis observed that every dominant medium inevitably creates a monopoly that shapes society, right up until a brand new medium comes along and shatters it. Take the Middle Ages in Europe, for example. The dominant medium was parchment, but parchment was scarce, it was really expensive, and it took highly specialized skills just to prepare it and write on it. This physical limitation allowed the church to essentially hoard access to information, creating a massive monopoly of knowledge centered around tradition. But then, Then bureaucrats got their hands on cheap, abundant paper, and they built a totally different type of monopoly, one focused on administration and huge state centralization. Moving on to Section 2, media of time and space. To understand how these monopolies actually work on the ground, we have to look at Innis's grand historical framework, time versus space. There is a stark, super important contrast here. Time-biased media are heavy. They're durable. Think Sumerian clay tablets or massive Egyptian stone pyramids. Because you can't exactly move them around easily, but they last basically forever, they bind a culture to time. They decentralize power into hierarchical institutions with a deep focus on religion and eternity. On the flip side, space-biased media are light and fragile, stuff like papyrus and paper. You can't build a lasting monument out of papyrus, but you can throw it in a saddlebag and send a message across an entire continent. So light materials bind a culture to space. They let empires, like the Romans, centralize their power, build enormous bureaucracies, and manage trade over just massive distances. So when we map this progression out, it serves as a kind of historical key. It shows us exactly how shifting from stone to papyrus to print literally rewired the operational structure of human civilization. Shifting from stone to papyrus moved power from priests to bureaucrats. Shifting to the printing press sparked intense nationalism and fragmented individualism. And today, with electronic media, we are seeing the total collapse of both space and time, pulling us toward a completely new reality. Which brings us to Section 3, paper, print, and power. Let's fast forward a bit to the mechanical age, an era totally defined by paper, print, and the explosive centralization of authority. The big takeaway here is understanding what we call the mechanical age. The printing press wasn't just a machine to crank out books faster. It fundamentally changed how human beings thought. Print is what's known as a hot medium. It's visually intense, it's uniform, it's repetitive. It took human thought and fractured it into fragmented, specialized categories. Suddenly, you have the isolated, silent reader, which bred these extreme patterns of individualism. And politically, print allowed empires to control vast, faraway margins from one intensely unified center. Imagine London effectively controlling the American colonies just by sending printed edicts and paper administration across the ocean. It was a one-way, outward explosion of power. But, as the brilliant historian Arnold Toynbee pointed out, this kind of massive center margin structure always runs into a crisis. Eventually, the speed-up of information causes the pieces out on the margins to detach and form their own centers. The American colonies broke away from Great Britain precisely because the slow speed of ships simply couldn't sustain that center margin control anymore. Once a system hits its mechanical speed limit, the empire inevitably fractures. So, I really want you to pause and consider this dramatic pivot. What actually happens to human society, to our politics, to our own minds, when we leave the slow, mechanical march of paper completely behind, and our main tool of communication suddenly moves at the speed of light? That brings us to Section 4, the electric implosion. This is where we bridge Innis's foundational concepts of time and space over to Marshall McLuhan's famous analysis of our modern electric age. McLuhan gave us an unbelievably powerful tool with his famous phrase, "The medium is the message." You know, people always try to argue that a machine is just neutral, that it's all about what you choose to do with it. McLuhan says, absolutely not. That is an illusion. We shouldn't just be looking at what a machine produces, whether it's broadcasting a highbrow documentary or a trashy reality show. The real message of any technology is the way it radically restructures our human associations, the pace of our lives, and the very depth of our involvement with each other. Unlike the mechanical age of print, which, remember, was explosive, pushing outward from a central authority, the electric age is implosive. Electricity instantly wraps the entire planet in a global embrace. Through the telegraph, the telephone, TV, and now the internet, we have technologically extended our own central nervous system globally. We have effectively abolished the old protective buffers of space and time. Now, here is the crucial paradigm shift you really need to grasp, and it perfectly answers Innis's historical concerns. Because of our long history with paper and railways, we just naturally assume that more technology equals more centralization. But McLuhan says the exact opposite. Electricity does not centralize, but decentralizes. Think about it. A railway system demands massive, centralized urban railheads. But an electric grid, it makes power and information equally available everywhere, all at once. Any place, literally a remote farmhouse with a Wi-Fi connection, can suddenly act as a center of power. Those old, rigid, center-margin empires simply dissolve. And finally, Section 5, Retribalizing the Global Village. Let's take a hard look at the psychological and social reality you and I are actually inhabiting today. What we are living through right now is essentially the return of the nomad. Because electric speed mingles all cultures and information instantly, it completely shatters that isolated, specialist individual we saw back in the print era. In the mechanical age, you could afford to be detached. You could read a newspaper about a war months after it ended. But today, through our smartphones and global data networks, the action and the reaction happen at exactly the same time. This total, instantaneous interdependence plunges us right back into a state of intense tribal involvement. We aren't fragmented specialists anymore. We are forced every single day to react to the world as a whole. We are instantaneous, nomadic gatherers of knowledge living in a singular global village. Seriously, if you have ever felt totally overwhelmed by the relentless flood of modern news or the absolute chaos of social media, you are not alone. It is precisely because your own nervous system has been technologically extended to incorporate the entirety of mankind all at once. There are literally no margins left to retreat to. We're back in the village square, but that square is now the size of the entire planet. So, I'm going to leave you with one final provocative thought. Our historical deep dive today shows us that we've moved from the heavy stones of ancient empires to the explosive paper of the Renaissance and now to an electric web that mimics our very consciousness. As you step out of the lecture hall today, I want you to look at your smartphone, your AI tools, your feeds, not just as passive screens, but as active extensions of your own mind. The medium is rewiring us as we speak. So, will we consciously seize the possibilities of this digital era to program a better global nervous system? Or are we just going to remain numbed by our own technological illusions? Think about what kind of village you're helping to build. Thank you for joining me for today's explainer. Keep questioning the medium and keep learning.